So next we're going to have to move on to flame. So that's really not that difficult at all because their shader is pretty good. So let's just go, we're going to go into flames, going to make sure that we have this merged in. I'm going to go back to out. I'm just going to make a new mantra. I'm going to go to objects, get rid of candidate. We're going to go flames. We're going to do set geo. I'm going to go manual. And I know that the flames start showing up around 1136, so let's just go into like 1143. I think that's a good frame. And we're going to go out of manual. Okay, so we're not viewing our flame right now because the ice is here, but we don't have flame with the viewer flag on it, but that's fine. So I'm going to just call this flame. Alright, so if we view this, there are our flames working up into the ice. So let's just kick off a render and see what that looks like. Alright, so we got our flame. It's kind of hard to tell if this is going to work or not. There's one thing that I forgot to mention that I'm going to just do now before we get too far from it. So when we were doing our ice, one of the things that allowed us to have transmission of that blue color through the ice and make it look good is that if you look in, if you go to the rendering tab and then down by shading, right here it says enable absorption and nested dielectrics. So we want to turn that on. And this is just a way of scattering light and dealing with surface priority in order to give us just the correct way to shade things. I can't go too far into it, but there is documentation, so I would suggest looking at it if you're interested. But just make sure when you're rendering your ice that this is checked on. And then as for the flame, so we've got this render going here, and there's one thing that I want to do. I'm going to set something up, so I'm going to go into manual. We're going to go back into ice, or not ice, we're going to go into magic. And then where we have our flame, we have this pyro post process. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to keep the shading over here. And I'm going to make a null out flame render. Make sure our render flag is here. We'll view it here. And the reason that I did this is that we're going to be creating a volume light, and it's really easy to find the volume light within this geometry object, but if we had to look through it or search for it in this magic object, it's going to take a bit. And so what's going on is in this pyro post process, this is where we're defining all the attributes of our shader. And if you go into here, you can see that there's a lot of stuff happening, and then within there, there's a matte net. And then this is where our pyro shader is. And then this is where it's assigned. And so if you assign a shader, if you give it a pyro post process, I guess, then if you assign it a shader top level, that top level shader isn't going to do anything. So just make sure that you deal with everything in this pyro post process. So this might look good since this is just now being ignited, I guess. So let's go farther down into a later frame, and I want to see what that looks like with the render. So I think that's looking cool. I think it's a bit too hot though, so we're gonna have to tweak the settings in the pyro post process. So as you see here, this now looks different. It's because I just paused the video, made some tweaks myself so that you didn't have to sit and watch me do it step by step. So the things that I changed are temperature at 0 Kelvin. We would increase this so that this gives us more of a yellowy orange. And then the temperature at 1 Kelvin, we brought this down to, I mean, let's just make this an even 1380. So with that, this gives us just better colors for our flame. Now there's one thing that we can do. I'm not going to do it for the render, but in case you're interested, So if I go into the alpha, the flame doesn't have an alpha. And generally, I think the preferred method from side effects is that flames don't have alpha and that you always plus them on in comp. And this is what you're supposed to do. However, I constantly get requests for flames to have alpha because production doesn't care about what Houdini thinks. So they always want flames with alpha. There's a way to get it. I don't think it's a great way, but if you really want, it's going to change the look of this, but there's ways to bring it back around in comp. You could say something like density instead of density, which is, there is no density here. It's just looking at flame and temperature. You could just make this flame. So now if we render this, it's not gonna, it's gonna change the look, you'll see. But then it's also going to give us an alpha. And this is in bindings in the post process. So yeah, now this is much thicker. So it'll disappear. What happens when you hit this button over here is that it basically pre-mults. But we can see that there is an alpha there that is semi-usable. However, usually when comp asks for something like that, I just tell them to key it and use luminosity, and that'll give you an alpha. Is that the correct way to do it? I'm not actually sure, but I don't know. Ain't my comp, ain't my problem. Like, it is my problem, but so far we've made it work with either changing this to flame or comp just making their own alpha. Alright, so we have our flame. I think it's looking fine. But next what we need to do is we have to select flames, and then we need to create a volume light. So I'll just put this up here. And so volume light, I'm just going to call this flame light so we know what we're doing. And what it's going to need is a material. So what we do is now, instead of having to dig through magic, it's not going to be in the matte net because it makes its own matte net. So now we're going to go to flames. We're going to go to pyro post process. And then in here, we go to the matte net and we use that pyro shader. I'm going to go to render view. My render view crashed earlier, so I had to reset it. So if we go into the out, we see here that we should have all just candidate lights, which means that now our volume light is there. Because right now this flame isn't affecting the bowl at all, which means that it won't be affecting the ice that it's growing up around. And that ain't cool. So if we have that volume light, let's hit render. We'll see what it does. Alright, so I think that it is lighting the scene, but I don't think it's lighting it enough. So I'm going to go back up here, and where it says flame light, I'm going to increase the exposure. We'll just inch it up, so we'll do an exposure of 1. We're going to snapshot this. I'm going to start rendering. Alright, we can see now that, yes, now this is lighting it. We can see a bit of the reflection in the marble basin thing. So if we go back and forth, that is lighting it. I still think I want to take it higher. So I'm gonna make this 3. Okay. I think that's probably enough. We don't need to go too crazy with it, but yep, this is now lighting this, and this is showing up in the reflection. I think that looks cool. And one way we can just, we're gonna take a look. I'm gonna go back to our mantra. I'm gonna add ice. We don't need the cloud, we just need the ice because this is just going to be a test. So let's go, since this starts growing on around 1136, let's do 1140. And let's see if these flames are lightening up the ice that we have, because the two should interact. Okay, so this isn't done rendering, it's still going, but we can see now that this flame makes it pretty hot inside this ice. Is it too much Have we gone too far? I don't know. I think that would be probably the correct amount of light coming out of it, so I think it's probably good. We can also see a lot of the bluish ice reflected into the bowl, which I think looks pretty cool. So I can't know for sure until we see this actually rendered out if this is the correct amount of lighting. I suppose I could take it down to, instead of an exposure of 3, do it to 2. And that might look a little less extreme. I still kind of liked it at 3. We're going to do 2.5 and split the difference, as if you have been in the industry, you've heard 1,000 times. And more than 1,000 times, I'm sure. So yeah, 2.5, we're going to stick with that. I think this is looking good. So we have our ice, and it's shaded, and we have our flame that's shaded with the volume light. I think that's all looking pretty good. I can tell here that this doesn't have velocity, or it doesn't have motion blur, and I'm wondering if that's because I just don't have motion blur on. We need to go to our ice and just make sure. Okay, so this should have velocity blur, and we need to make sure here in our rendering, let's see, allow motion blur. This ice in the center isn't going to require motion blur, but the pieces on the outside should be blurred because they do start to move relatively quickly. So one thing that I forgot to add here is that our ice here needs to have a trail, because this is the bit that's going to be moving. Make sure that we have compute velocity, and so then now when we render this, this should be motion blurred, so I'm going to let that go. It's going to have to think about it. Okay, I don't need to render all of this to be able to tell that, yep, now motion blur is indeed happening here. So we're good. I'm just going to kill this.